Let's talk about monuments. What is a monument? This is a monument, that is a monument, this is also a monument, and sadly this is a monument as well. Art historian Erica Doss furthers the conversation and helps us understand more deeply what a monument is in her book Memorial Mania, Public Feeling in America. The term memorial mania describes what we're seeing on the news and all over the nation, an obsession with the creation and understanding of memorials. She states, memorial mania is contextualized by a highly successful public art industry, burgeoning interest in memorial studies and living or experiencing history, and shifting understandings of national identity. And what are memorials but public art, right? Public art engages audiences in representing a something. And in this way, every memorial across the world are public art, regardless of their quality. That's something that they communicate is a historical narrative, as Doss said, shifting understandings of national identity. These pieces communicate a history. Each piece of their composition, the figures they represent, the space and place they inhabit, they become a narrative. To this end, monuments, paintings, fine art, literature, and architecture all share kinship. Each serve the purpose that Doss describes, and each create their own historical narrative, whether it is painfully obvious or a little more subtle. With that in mind, I'll maintain film is easily the most effective in this game. No other medium of art is as accessible, widespread, or popular as cinema, and no other is as effective at weaving a narrative. Understanding the cultural, social, and political impact film has had since Louis-Aimé Augustin Lapronce shot The First Man Walking Shakily Across a Garden in 1888, historian Natalie Davis takes this understanding even further in her book Slaves on Screen, Film and Historical Vision, claiming that movies are not just vehicles to depict narratives, but are themselves historical narratives. This certainly holds true for memorials and monuments. Each one is a historical narrative translated into stone, bronze, steel, and hopefully more often trash at the bottom of a river. Movies function in a similar way, that stone and bronze translated into moving pictures. Let's talk briefly about the ways that film creates its own narratives and affects public memory with some of the more recognizable subjects. World War II movies teach the public that young Americans, and sometimes British men, fought bravely against Nazis all by themselves, with no other help from any other country whatsoever. Vietnam movies teach a story that America fought a bad war, fought by good people, against evil communists. Cop movies teach us that cops are heroes that sometimes have to make tough choices. And it's shocking to see how prevailing these narratives become in the larger society, right? And these things are shown more tangibly through the education system and political sentiments. They are reflected through these movies. People believe what they see in World War II movies, and Vietnam movies, and cop movies, and the cultures around these things are palpable. There are movies, however, that serve as what this video will call a counter-history to these prevailing ones, and I won't dare to claim that there aren't movies that don't push the envelope and fight against these toxic narratives. In fact, these sorts of films will become key to my subject, and I will try to cover them where I can. I named 3 historical subjects here that films will tackle and become monuments of, and of course there are more. However, one subject becomes somewhat sparse and often depicts very poorly the history it's trying to talk about, and with clear intent of the filmmaker attempting to erase the truths about this history and form a toxic narrative. And this subject is North American slavery. It are these monuments I want to understand, and in doing so, this video will hopefully answer this question. In what ways has cinema from 1915 to present day depicting slavery served to shape American society's understanding and memory of the institution? To answer this question, I'll be picking apart 8 movies and understanding the way they function as historical narratives, hopefully circling back and answering this central question, so that we might understand not just how slavery is depicted in film, but why. Because that why is key to understanding the way the institution of slavery is understood in America, inside and outside of film. I wanted to cover a wide variety of films here because I wanted a large sample size of different movies from different directors with different conditioning and backgrounds, different historical contexts, different times, different technologies available to them, and covering films that don't just tackle slavery in one genre, but try to do so through a different genre and theme. And so, this may have been expected, but we do inevitably have to start in 1915 with D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. So from this point on, I'm going to go ahead and give 2 warnings. One is a spoiler warning. I'm going to have to spoil every movie so that I can gauge a fuller analysis of the narrative it's trying to translate. And 2, a content warning. Naturally, because I'm tackling the subject of slavery, there's going to be some brutal imagery, some graphic depictions, and racist depictions of the institution. Not all of it is accurate. In fact, a lot of it is not. But I will be showing clips from these movies, so I'm going to go ahead and put that warning out there now. If you're uncomfortable seeing this, I definitely recommend that you go ahead and leave or go ahead and skip to the conclusion so you can understand where this analysis led. Oh boy, here we go. I'm going to quickly as possible summarize the 3-hour film. The Birth of a Nation is a 1915 film, like I said, directed by D.W. Griffith. It tells the story of American slavery, the Civil War, and the ensuing years of Reconstruction. The movie follows 2 families, the Stonemans and Camerons, who represent the North and South respectively, the Stonemans being from the North, the Camerons being from the South, being slave owners. The families are depicted as friendly and close, the Civil War tearing them apart. By Griffith's account, the Civil War was a tragedy caused not by the South trying to maintain slavery, but, and bear with me here, by Charles Sumner's mulatto slave to seducing him into starting the Civil War. Yeah, war ensues, and white Southerners are depicted as impoverished and destitute, while black freedmen and Northerners are depicted as running the South in Reconstruction, through violence, rape, and political manipulation. However, the KKK is eventually formed and saves the day for whites. The end. That's D.W. Griffith's account of the Civil War and Reconstruction. I glossed over the plot itself for a reason. The truth is, all of these factual inconsistencies only matter to the extent that we can understand exactly what D.W. Griffith is trying to say. The truth is, he's not doing this because he's ignorant. I mean, he's clearly ignorant, but he knows that these things are wrong and incorrect for the most part. His intention with misrepresenting this history this way is clear. Griffith wants to teach the audience that Reconstruction was a failure on behalf of the North, that the North looted and pillaged the South, destroying it, and was not able to meet the needs of white Southerners following the war, giving too much political and social power to black freedmen. This line of thought isn't exactly uncommon in other historical narratives either. It aligns very neatly with the Dunning School thought, which ascertains a similar narrative. As with all of these films, the devil's going to be in the details. Look at the way Griffith depicts slavery before the Civil War. Slaves are happy, they're enjoying their time with their master, and of course he's not going to show any of the brutality of the institution. The imagery he uses is very important. He uses cutesy imagery to describe the South before the war. Puppies, kittens, beautiful women running around, and like I said, the slaves are enjoying all of this. This flows into a jarring juxtaposition following the Civil War and into Reconstruction, where things are depicted as broken, destitute, and all of these characters that we once saw running around happily are now impoverished and needing to sell their things to get by. And this narrative that he's depicting here, this narrative of impoverishment for white Southerners, is not something that wasn't exactly uncommon. Both white Southerners and white Northerners had an idea that this is how Reconstruction had panned out. And D.W. Griffith being able to translate this through film was effective, jarringly so. In February 1915, Woodrow Wilson, at a special White House viewing, saw Birth of a Nation and was very impressed. And the movie is still talked about for its technological prowess today, often to a degree that lets viewers and historians alike ignore what this film is trying to depict. Griffith writes his characters in a very telling way as well. Charles Sumner, who I mentioned earlier, is depicted as a sleazy, ghoulish old man, always needs to fix his hairpiece to cover up his bald head. Almost every black character in this film is played by a white actor in blackface, depicted as moronic, goofy, or cartoonishly evil. This is juxtaposed by the handsome and beautiful families of the Stonemans and Camerons, respectable and kind, and the black characters who remain in servitude following emancipation are depicted as respectable and conveniently subservient. So in totality, Griffith goes beyond the Dunning School of Thought. He's able to use technology to reach a wider audience, something that we'll see in the movies to come. And he's able to absolve whiteness on both the sides of the North and South through the way he depicts different characters and the imageries he uses. And the Reconstruction narrative that he creates will last well into the 50s, and this movie and that narrative will continue to resonate today. Serving as a counter-history to this is Birth of a Race, a 1918 American silent film directed by Jon Noble. The film is much less plot-driven. It focuses on Genesis, Exodus, and the story of colonization in America. It preaches a lot on equality and talks very simply about these subject matters. Rather than using plot devices and characters to create a story, it simply uses history to try to justify equality. It serves as a counter-history to Birth of a Nation, which used history to justify racism, and instead it just generally goes over the Bible stories and American history to understand that, at its core, it was created to be equal. Even if we know that's not true, and the Founding Fathers were contradictory, it is still what this film is trying to depict, and it is using that to reach a wider audience, similar to how Birth of a Nation did with its use of these things. Sadly, the film didn't receive the same critical acceptance that Birth of a Nation did. It was considered a failure, and while it did try to depict American history and God as a justification for equality for all races, the film did not have the budgetary need nor the publicity to take off and serve as a proper counter-history to Birth of a Nation. Nonetheless, it does serve as its own narrative, a narrative that tries to justify equality to an American audience at a time when, certainly, they were not able to. And it did so very simply. It said this is how man was created, it said this is how America was created, and this is why man, white man, and black men should be equal. Moving into 1935, we have Shirley Temple, the littlest rebel. Shirley Temple, who you may remember from
Animal crackers in my soup,
was an American child actor and icon, renowned for her acting and dancing. Here, she stars as a Confederate. Wait. Littlest Rebel follows the story of Virgie, the daughter of a plantation owner turned Confederate soldier. The story depicts the apparent difficulties that Virgie faced living on the plantation during the Civil War, where Union soldiers frequent the house for pillaging and raiding while her father's off at war. As the war turns up, Virgie and her mother, along with most of their slaves, leave the plantation with her father, heading to her aunt's house in Richmond for safety. The journey takes Virgie's mother's life, and Virgie's father is captured by one of the friendlier Union generals, who decides to let Virgie and her father go on account of her being just so gosh darn cute and also white. Unfortunately, they don't make it so far, as one of the Union soldiers recognizes Virgie's dad, and he's arrested and set for execution along with the Union soldier who aided him. Virgie and Bill, one of his slaves, then dance their way to Washington to make a plea to Abraham Lincoln, who sits little Virgie up on his lap and shares an apple with her, setting her father and the soldier free. So there's clearly a lot to unpack here. This movie does a lot wrong, and suffering through it was kind of a task. Again, it uses cutesy imagery in the same way that Griffith did to try to soften the reality of slavery, depicting Shirley as a kind, loving daughter of a slave owner, treating her slaves with respect and love. Simultaneously, the only slaves they show are obedient, dedicated to their masters, or cartoonishly stupid. And there's a game this movie plays here, right? It uses this icon, Shirley, to make all of these moving parts work together. Oh, look at little Shirley doing blackface. Oh, look at the way she orders her slaves around and wears a Confederate hat. She's such a darling. No thanks. This narrative, in general, is not far off from what Griffith depicted pre-Civil War life to be, and it's driven home by this icon. This narrative becomes palatable because Shirley makes it palatable, and because the only characters depicted as competent in the movie are white. The general on the Union side and her father, along with Abraham Lincoln, are the central white characters that drive the film, and Shirley is depicted as more talented, competent than any slave that the movie depicts. And it's horrific, and it's that narrative that it's trying to create. It is really not that much better than Birth of a Nation. Instead of these characters in silent film, it uses an American icon, Shirley Temple, to drive that narrative. Now let's dial back a little over a decade to 1920, with Oscar Micheaux's Within Our Gates. I wanted to put this one after Shirley because it is both a counter-history and a compelling narrative of its own that doesn't seem to be before Shirley Temple of all things. The story follows the efforts of Sylvia Laundrie, an educated and affluent African-American woman. While at her cousin's, she is waiting for her fiancé Conrad to return to her. Alma, in love with Conrad, manipulates the situation to seem as though Sylvia was being unfaithful, earning Conrad's wrath where he leaves to Brazil. Sylvia returns to her home in the south where she meets Reverend Jacobs, the administrator of a school for black children. With the state and local institutions affording no money for the school, Jacobs would have to close, wherein Sylvia volunteers to raise $5,000 to save it. She heads for Boston, meeting Dr. Vivian, who aids her in this effort. She is then struck by the car of Alana Warwick, a philanthropist who offers to help in this mission. Originally discouraged by Miss Stratton, a woman who greatly fears the education of blacks, she later increases the amount she donates to $50,000. Alma's stepbrother, Larry, tries to get Sylvia to steal the money, but she escapes north. Larry is shot in the bank robbery, and the movie ends with Alma telling Dr. Vivian Sylvia's full story, wherein she was adopted by a poor black family. Her mother and father are lynched after being accused of murdering the white landlord Griddlestone, and it is revealed that Sylvia's Griddlestone's brother's estranged daughter. The movie then ends proper with the marriage of Sylvia and Dr. Vivian. This movie is primarily one of the importance of education. A common theme in Shirley Temple and Birth of a Nation is one of black slaves and freedmen being uneducated, and in these narratives and that depiction, we see that these filmmakers fear an educated black class, a fear that Oscar Michaud and many artists and writers of the New Negro movement understood was present. This is the narrative of this movie. It consistently speaks on and praises black education, with these central themes constantly revolving around this. Black characters that resist education are depicted as scoundrels and traitors to their own race, while educated black characters such as Sylvia and Jacobs are depicted as key to the advancement and liberation of the black community from Jim Crow and racism. Though this movie does not talk directly on slavery, it understands its after effects and the Jim Crow era, and serves as a narrative to resist and shatter those created by movies like Birth of a Nation. We'll make a large jump here to 1975 with Richard Fleischer's Mandingo. Before I get into this one though, I want to maintain that despite what this film and its sequel will attempt to depict, a slave owner cannot have a consensual relationship with their slave. I will refer to the moments where white slave owners are depicted as having these relationships as what they are, which is rape. With that being said, let's jump into this mess. To its very limited credit, the movie starts with an actual depiction of slavery being harsh, something that Shirley and Birth of a Nation couldn't afford to us. The movie then follows Hammond, the son of a slave owner, in his journey to get married, and in his journey in the Mandingo fighting business. He marries his cousin Blanche, all the while continuing to rape his women slaves. While on Charles' plantation, Hammond rapes Ellen, whom he buys and brings home along with his wife. On his outing, Hammond purchases Meade, a Mandingo fighter he takes an interest in. After winning a fight, Hammond takes Meade home. Hammond finds on their honeymoon that Blanche is not a virgin and becomes furious, rejecting her at every turn, Blanche becoming depressed and turning to alcohol. As Hammond leaves the plantation, Blanche rapes Meade and is pregnant with his child. Hammond finds out after the child is killed by their doctor and poisons Blanche. He then kills Meade in a boiling pot of water, and another slave kills Hammond's father and runs away. The movie ends with Hammond clutching his gun and crying on the porch by his father's dead body. Despite its poor reception and it being called out for its racism, this movie is infuriating, and it becomes clear that this is a product of both blaxploitation, ignorance, and racism on behalf of the director. What's most interesting about it, too, is that it's clear that Fleischer made some effort to give what he thought was a realistic depiction of slavery. In doing so, he created an exploitative film wherein rape is attempted to be retold as love, and Mandingo fighting is glorified as a sport. And herein lies an issue as these movies continue on. As we moved out of the civil rights movement and out of Vietnam, the depictions of this institution became a little less egregious, and certainly the Dunning School no longer dominates this narrative. However, in this idea that somehow a grand understanding has been struck, movies like this are created. This narrative is one that persists itself as an accurate and brutal, and instead becomes a narrative that justifies rape, glorifies slave fighting as a sport, and consistently exploits and commodifies the black body on screen. It is this issue that we'll run into a lot as we get into these modern movies, and Mandingo is a very early example of this, and it's important to keep in mind the narrative that this is creating. Its sequel does the same, and while I won't get into it because there's really no use, it does the same thing and attempts to justify Hammond as a good slave master. It attempts to justify Mandingo fighting as sort of like a boxing sport, and attempts to justify slave-master relationships as anything but rape. With another jump, we're in familiar territory. It's 2013, racism is over, and 12 Years a Slave created a perfect world where slavery was never depicted poorly again. All is right. Right?
Wrong!
12 Years a Slave, a film by Steve McQueen, is based on the true story of Solomon, a freedman violinist who was sold into slavery by those he thought were fellow performers. In captivity, his name is changed to Platt, and he moves from plantations of Ford to Epp to Judge Turner. He frequently impresses Ford, which earns the jealousy of an overseer who then tries to kill Solomon. Solomon is protected by Ford, who is forced to move Solomon to the plantation of Epp, who is depicted as cruel, consistently raping his slave Patsy, his wife abusing that slave in jealousy and hatred. Cotton worms plague the plantation for a season, and Solomon moves to the field of Turner, cutting cane, earning his favor enough to play the violin and earn some money, which he attempts to use to barter with a white slave Armsby to get his letter sent north so he might be freed. Armsby rats him out, but Solomon is able to avoid punishment. Eventually, he meets Bass, a Canadian abolitionist and carpenter whom Solomon speaks with. He is able to convince Bass to send a letter, and the movie ends with Solomon reuniting with his family. This movie does a great deal well. Its depiction of the brutality of slavery is there, and it is relatively faithful to the story it's depicting. Visually, it's quite strong, and I think I'd safely take this over Mandingo. In fact, I know I would. However, it's not perfect, and it plays up an aggravating trope to an annoying degree. That is, the kind master trope. The depictions of Ford and Turner are offensive in this regard, and McQueen depicting them this way, and through actors like Cumberbatch, serves to eliminate and absolve white masters from these narratives. I don't want to make it seem like 12 Years a Slave is as egregious as something like Shirley Temple in that regard, but it really does seem like directors discussing slavery just can't help themselves with this shit. And what becomes most disturbing in this regard is what I poked fun at earlier. Viewers will come in and out of this movie with the belief that this is how slavery happened, and that this is an accurate depiction, an intent McQueen expressed himself with his claim that this movie pulls no punches. With that notion in mind, it allows a narrative that white masters like Ford were there and were good, and glorifies them, shifting the narrative to absolve whiteness, and in effect absolve the institution of slavery to a degree. Because if there were masters like Ford, then it couldn't have been all that bad. And that is the narrative that 12 Years a Slave can create. It is not a wholly bad movie, and I think it does a lot more right than it does wrong, but its depiction of these masters does inevitably create a dangerous narrative. In the same vein of movies that get way too much credit in being successes of their depiction of slavery is Quentin Tarantino's Django Unchained. The film follows the story of Django, a slave bought by Dr. Schultz, a German bounty hunter who needs the assistance of Django in hunting the Brittle brothers, 3 overseers who had abused Django and his wife during their time at the Karuka plantation. They find and kill the brothers, and Django begins training under Dr. Schultz as a bounty hunter, with hopes that they will partner up and Django will find his wife. They discover she is currently a slave at Candyland, the 4th largest cotton plantation in Mississippi. They infiltrate the plantation under the guise of 2 slave owners looking to purchase a Mandingo fighter for $12,000, and hope that they can simply buy Django's wife and leave north for a cheaper price. Things go wrong when Calvin Candy's head house slave, Stephen, catches on, and Candy forces them to buy Django's wife for the full $12,000. Schultz kills Candy, Schultz is killed, and after a lengthy and bloody gunfight, Django is captured and sentenced to a life of mining. Convincing his captors of a hefty bounty at Candyland, Django escapes and frees his wife, killing the remaining overseers, Stephen, and destroying the plantation with dynamite. So let's go briefly into what this movie does right in helping deconstruct toxic narratives. I think the greatest thing it does, honestly, is its depiction of a Western in the context of slavery. Now this comes to bite it in the butt a little bit later, and I'll discuss that, but it helps remind an audience that slavery was not limited to a pocket in the Southeast, but reached far into Texas and into the Midwest, where the famous Western movies Americans tend to love so much all took place. In this way, Tarantino is deconstructing a Western as a slave movie, and in general I think that's a worthy endeavor. Now whether he does that well is up for debate, because in doing so he distorts the narrative of slavery in a peculiar way, and begs the question of, is there a risk to depicting history through a different genre? Does it muddle the subject and leave a different memory? In this case, I think so. First, the comedy. There is a danger in depicting tragic histories through comedic elements, and this movie shows that danger. For example, the depiction of the Ku Klux Klan, an organization created for the continued violent oppression of black people, is depicted here as a motley crew of idiots and jokers. While I think it's good to depict how childish and stupid the KKK's strange wizard customs are, there is no joke about the KKK. And with that spun into this narrative, it leaves an impression that that organization, as they existed and exist now, aren't to be taken seriously and, more importantly, can be written off. And there's a real danger to that. Another example is the use of the N-word, which this movie came under a good amount of fire for. Now, I'm not an authority on any of this, however, I understand the word was used historically in slavery. I didn't critique it in 12 years because the movie uses it in a much different way, and it's the element of comedy in Django that can make the use problematic in its narrative. When the word is used, it's almost always in a joking fashion, because the tone in which it's used is almost always a joking and playful one. I understand that this may not have been the director's intent in this case, but this usage treads a dangerous line. But the more important danger in this genre shift comes in it being an action-packed Western. Now, I enjoy gunfights in movies quite a bit, but as this movie functions also as a narrative on slavery, therein lies a problem with this genre shift. I think that Django becomes a film that exploits slavery and uses it as a backdrop as an action Western, not the other way around. It commodifies the black experience and trauma and creates an action movie, and it's this narrative that it becomes. In some ways, it's brutal. It spares no remorse for white overseers or owners. On the other, it uses this brutality and exploits it in the narrative. And that's what Django ends up being. And finally, there's Get Out, directed by Jordan Peele. The most recent on this list, Get Out does something similar to Django and takes on slavery through a genre beyond drama. And its narrative is one done through a horror thriller. The movie follows Chris, a black photographer who leaves with his girlfriend Rose to her parents' house. Nervous about the meeting and her not telling her parents he's black, his fears are confirmed in some very awkward moments with her father, mother, and brother. He finds out that this weekend is actually a huge get-together for the family and prepares to meet them. Meanwhile, he's acquainted with the groundskeeper and maid of the house, both acting very strangely, speaking nervously and robotically. Chris goes for a smoke, and the mother becomes hostile and nervous, coaxing Chris into hypnosis, a process that sends him into an astral-like void with a small window into reality above that she calls the sunken place. The family arrives, and more awkward conversation ensues, and there he meets Logan, previously Andre, a character who is shown in the movie's opening scene of being kidnapped on the streets of a suburb. Logan acts very strangely in the same way as the groundskeeper and maid, and is with a white woman 30 years his senior. He accidentally takes a snap of him with the flash on, which sends Logan into a fit, where he screams at Chris, bleeding from the nose, "Get out!" Rose and him plan to leave after some conversation. During that conversation, the father holds a silent auction beside a picture of Chris, implying that they plan to sell Chris. Returning to the house, things become more peculiar, and Chris finds a box that shows Rose with the groundskeeper and maid before they were in those situations. Chris is captured, and it becomes clear that the brainwashing is used to sedate black men and women that Rose lures in, so that their minds may be taken over by older white people who aim to have a stronger, younger body. He's able to break free and kill almost everyone in the home, Rose being the last to go, being killed by the groundskeeper. He is picked up, finally, by his friend Rod, who had been investigating this from the back. I think of all the movies I've watched for this project, this one would have been my favorite. The narrative it creates is an interesting one, and while it is not a period piece, it nonetheless tackles slavery, the institution being contextualized through horror and modernity. And there's a power to that. This movie plays on real anxieties of losing control over oneself, of being oppressed and taken over without control. Despite not taking place on a plantation or in the 1800s, Get Out actually creates a narrative much more striking and poignant to modern audiences. Its theme of these bourgeois white people vying to take literal control and become the hosts of black bodies is a theme that both covers the brutal history of the black American experience, but serves as a modern narrative where the experience is commodified. And I think that's sort of where I want to set this conclusion. I came into this project with an attempt to understand the ways in which films depict slavery, and with an attempt to understand why. I think the why becomes clear in understanding the anxieties, fear, and guilt that still surround white Americans in this subject. In creating these films, each director attempted to create a narrative on slavery that in one way or another served to shape the memory of that institution. And each used different methods to express that narrative. I don't think there are right ways to do this, and if there are, I'm certainly not an authority on them. I do think there are wrong ways, or maybe I'd say toxic or offensive ways of doing so, but we never see a right way. We just see ways, and it's those we need to be cognizant of. Consuming media passively allows those narratives to infiltrate and warp memory, and the directors of these films are quite aware of that. White directors' commodification of the black experience and of slavery is in and of itself a narrative, and I chose Get Out last so this isn't forgotten. No matter how right a director is in this depiction, I want that understanding to always be present in the viewer's mind. Thank you.